to the Sea-Level Workshop. First of all, I'd like to just point out, I'm John Keener, Pacifica, by the way. We also have in attendance the Vice Mayor, Mayor Pro Tem, Sue Ross, and Mike O'Neill is somewhere around. Yeah, he's that there. And don't think anybody else from the city council. First of all, we will not have the economic analysis today, and I think somebody will comment more fully on that and when it will be available and so on. And secondly, I just wanted to point out something that I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but for those folks who are who have property, up in the hills and far away from the ocean, you're still a stakeholder in this process. And one main reason why you are is our sewage system, which I tend to bring up at every opportunity. Our sewage flows downhill close to the ocean where it's pumped to our treatment plant. And those pumps and the pipes are definitely under threat eventually from sea level rise. And as you can imagine, when those goes out, everybody from folks living close to the ocean to folks living up on the hills in Park Pacifica will be impacted. So with that cheerful note, I'll pass it on to Kevin Woodhouse, our city manager.
All right, thank you, Mayor Keener. Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Woodhouse, City Manager of Pacifica, and I really appreciate this turnout on such a beautiful day in Pacifica. We'll be here for a few hours or as long as you want to stay, so thank you for that. This is a very important topic, as you realize, and that's why you're in here on a beautiful day. I just want to ask a question to start with. How many folks have been to one of the public meetings so far? At least one. Okay, good. So what I wanted to briefly comment on, and then before turning it over to Planning Director Tina Wermeister, is about the schedule. So originally, this meeting was intended to be about the draft adaptation plan, the entire adaptation plan draft, which included the economic analysis and the recommended alternatives. But the project team, upon reviewing the progress and the data that we've been gathering, felt it prudent that we release the preliminary draft adaptation plan while we continue gathering the economic data and putting that together so that the next phase will be the final draft adaptation plan, which includes the economic analysis. It's important that the information that first comes out to the public is as thorough as we think we can get it at that time. One of the benefits of dividing this process into two drafts is that it really extends the time for which the public has to review and comment on these strategies and the analysis. So that's going to amount to more than 60 days. I don't know exactly. We're still working on some of the schedule details. So that's important to acknowledge. I also just want to acknowledge generally that this is an immensely complex topic, and my hands go to Tina and Tina Wermeister and Bonnie O'Connor and the consultant team in working through these complications, or complexities, I should say. And so this is time well spent here reviewing the preliminary draft plan. So I'll turn it over. That's all I wanted to really say. I'll turn it over to Tina.
I think I'm actually going to.
Okay. Hi.
Hi. I saw a lot of raise of hands who've been to public workshops before, so you're probably wondering who I am. I'm Kelsey Rugani. I'm with Kearns and West, and so I'll be helping to facilitate today. I'm filling in for Ben today, so a lot of you know Ben, but I'll be helping us through today. I'm going to walk us through the agenda and objectives for today, and a couple notes about public comment before I turn it over to Tina. But I also wanted the consultant staff, city staff, and we have a few staff from the Coastal Commission to introduce themselves. So I'll kind of walk us around.
Do you want to introduce yourself first?
Tina Wermeister, I'm the city's planning director.
Bonnie O'Connor, assistant planner.
Hi, I'm Bob Palio with Environmental Science Associates.
Hi, I'm James Jackson, also with Environmental Science Associates.
I'm Phil King, professor at San Francisco State. I'm working on the economic portion of the project.
Sorry.
Matt Marvin, with Kearns and West, part of the consulting group.
I'm Kelsey Ducklow. I'm a climate change analyst and grant coordinator at the Coastal Commission.
Thank you. Okay, so our meeting objectives for today is to provide an overview of the sea level rise planning process, including work completed to date, where we are now, and where we're headed. So a lot of you are experts on the process by now, and that'll be a little bit of a refresher. But for folks who this might be your first workshop, that'll really set a good context of where we are in the process and what the process includes. Provide an overview of the adaptation measures, including trade-offs between specific measures. Review and discuss considerations and methodology for identifying appropriate measures for Pacifica. And review and discuss draft adaptation measures identified for specific locations in Pacifica's coastal zone. We've broken up by 8 sub-areas. So how we're going to accomplish those objectives today, we do have an agenda on the back table. We'll give I'll turn it over to Tina to provide the update on the planning process, and she'll summarize some of the input provided to date. And then we'll go into the overview of adaptation measures, discussing trade-offs, considerations for identifying appropriate measures, and then give an overview of the draft adaptation measures by the different sub-areas. Then right around 1:30, we'll turn it over to the public comment and Q&A portion of the meeting. So a couple notes on that, and then we'll get you out of there right around 3 o'clock, so you can still enjoy this beautiful day. A couple notes I wanted to make. I'll come back to the ground rules on public participation and the Q&A. There are 2 different forms you'll see on the back table. We have a couple that I can pass around. But the blue sheet is a question/comment card. This is if you want to provide oral comment. And the larger comment form is if you would like to provide written comment. You are welcome to fill out both of them, but if you do want to provide oral comment, we ask that you fill out the blue card. And for the sake of, and Bonnie has some that she can pass around. And once you've filled it out, you can pass it in to Bonnie, you can pass it in to me. Once we get to public comment and Q&A, we'll go through the names in the order that we receive them. And I feel free to take one now, and you can kind of jot down notes through the presentation. I think for the sake of efficiency, we're going to try to push through the presentation and then open it up for Q&A and public comment. So feel free to take one now and jot down questions as they come up so you don't forget anything as you go through the presentation. And then lastly, before I turn it over to Tina, Kearns and West, we're a facilitation firm, and we like to set out some ground rules for the meeting. We can't have a productive meeting without all of you. So we ask that you please focus your input on the meeting objectives. That you honor the agenda and time limits for discussion, and as your facilitator, I'll be helping to keep us on time as well. We ask that you interact respectfully and to turn off or silence your cell phones as you can. Do those sound like good ground rules for the meeting that we can all get behind? Smile. Okay, perfect. Okay, well, I'm going to turn it over to Tina.
Good afternoon. Is this working? planning process for this project. And this first slide is going over the need for the project. So the current local coastal plan was adopted in 1980, so it's fairly old. It needs to be updated. We do have an update drafted, but it's not adopted yet, and that draft was prepared at a time before coastal commission requirement and state law requirement to consider adaptation strategies for sea level rise. So what we're doing now is we're preparing an adaptation plan, preparing policies that will be incorporated into the draft document, and then put to city council for approval, and then on to coastal commission for approval. So in March, the city council adopted goals for this project, and they are to bolster the efficacy of public safety efforts, to respond to climate change, to preserve existing neighborhoods and promote environmental justice and local economic vitality, and to preserve and enhance coastal access. So this slide here is showing an overview of the process. The first three boxes with checks next to them comprise the vulnerability assessment, which we've completed, and that's available. You all have probably seen it. That was identifying sea level rise projections, potential impacts, and assessing the risks. And where we are now is preparing adaptation measures and policy options for the council to consider. And then we'll move on to updating the local coastal plan and implementing and monitoring the plan. So this is these next two slides are a closer look at the schedule coming up, and I wanted to point out that this is also available at the back table, so you can take it with you, you don't have to take notes. The first two bullet points are where we are right now. We're analyzing adaptation alternatives and going to prepare policy recommendations. And right now, during this meeting, we're introducing and getting public comment on the preliminary adaptation plan. And by the end of July, we'll have a final draft adaptation plan prepared and released. As the city manager mentioned, this will include the economic analysis. And that'll start a public comment period that won't end until the end of August. And this period will include another public meeting on August 11th to get additional input. And we are accepting input now all the way through the end of August, so there is ample time. And so by the end of September, the schedule is to release the draft LCP update policies, respond to comments on the final draft adaptation plan, and then in October to work on the policies, to receive comments on the policies and have additional public meetings. And then finally, at the end of this year, bringing the documents to Planning Commission and City Council for consideration. So this is the city website. There's a link right on our front page, citypacifica.org. It's fairly easy to access. So before I turn it over to James to go over the adaptation strategies, I just wanted to mention a few words about managed retreat. So in the current adaptation alternatives that are being considered, managed retreat is an optional strategy for private properties. So that means the city also would not consider removing infrastructure that's required to serve private existing development of the properties. We feel that this is a reasonable approach to the required managed retreat study that the Coastal Commission requires. I know that the Coastal Commission wants us to go further, potentially consider mandatory retreat alternatives. We're not prepared to do that at this time, so I just wanted to mention that before James starts his presentation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And thanks for being here inside for a little while our friends are out on the beach having certainly miss the beach, but I'm happy to talk about this important issue with you all, so appreciate you coming out. So I'm going to run through the adaptation strategies that we are considering for each sub-area in Pacifica. And so first, I would like to talk about what the purpose of this analysis is. What's the purpose of analyzing different adaptation alternatives? And so what we're doing here is to come up with a reasonable picture of what adaptation could look like along Pacifica's coastline. And we have to come up with some reasonable alternatives that we think make sense, that meet the desires of the city and the public, and consider the existing conditions on the coastline, and also include a range of measures that are recommended to be analyzed by the Coastal Commission. And so these alternatives include protecting, whether through armor or through beach nourishment, and we've also looked at managed retreat at the request of the Coastal Commission, as Tina just said. And so a couple of key points that I wanted to make here for the purpose of this alternatives analysis. First, we're testing a number of potential strategies. So some realistic strategies that could be taken to manage coastal erosion and flooding on the coast into the future with sea level rise. And so this analysis will inform what our adaptation plan looks like and the policies that we come up with to start guiding these adaptations in the city and actually making it happen. In order to come up with a cost-benefit analysis of each of these adaptation alternatives, we have to define them through time and assign specific years to things like when were we going to upgrade a coastal armoring structure? When are we going to add beach nourishment for alternatives that include beach nourishment? And we came up with the timing based on sea level rise projections that are provided by the state and are issued as guidance for everyone that's looking at sea level rise. So we're looking at a certain amount of sea level rise for the purpose of our analysis, but that doesn't mean that we're assuming, or the city will assume, that a certain amount of sea level rise is going to occur at any given time. The point of the analysis is to come up with some realistic strategies through time to analyze what is the cost, what are the benefits. And so we're using the high sea level rise scenario to do that. But the adaptation plan isn't going to prescribe actions based on this high sea level rise scenario. It's going to be based on observable change. How much is the coast eroding? How much is the sea level actually rising? So we're not going to be marching into time assuming that there's a certain amount of sea level rise. We'll actually have a plan that is based on what happens on the ground. And so if there's more or less sea level rise, our adaptation actions in reality are going to change accordingly. And like I said, this study does not mean that we're forcing Pacifica to assume high sea level rise is going to occur. And it also doesn't define right now what Pacifica will do for the foreseeable future. This is a starting point for adaptation. So get a good picture of what different adaptations look like and inform ourselves to develop a good informed adaptation plan and develop appropriate policies to get started. This is just a starting point. We're not defining everything that the city will do into the future. And so in these strategies, we can only include so many alternative measures for to meet the schedule and budget of this project. We have to choose or narrow down the adaptation measures to some realistic and achievable adaptation strategies. So if there's a measure that could be used to adapt to sea level rise, whether it's to manage erosion or to manage flooding, and it's not included in these adaptation strategies, that doesn't mean that it's not valid and that it can't be considered in the future. So, in order to come up with these alternatives, we looked at all the sub-areas in the coast, on the coast of Pacifica, which match up with the city's planning areas. And we looked at our list of adaptation measures that we came up with, a measure being an individual tool like placing rock armor, for placing beach nourishment. And we looked critically at each area and thought together what makes sense for each of these areas. And so we went through a process of evaluating each measure and its suitability for use in each sub-area in Pacifica. Does the measure protect existing development? That's an important thing. Everyone is concerned about protecting our existing development, and so does the measure meet that purpose? Does the measure also align with community values? Other things like maintaining recreation or shoreline access, maintaining the beach, other public values that we've gotten as input through this project process in previous meetings. During vulnerability assessment, we've got a lot of input on how people use the coast, what are they concerned about on the coastline. So does a particular measure align with these community values that we've observed and gathered throughout the process? And also another important consideration is does the measure fit with the actual setting of the coastline? If it's a steep cliff, you have different measures that are applicable than a low-lying area that is subject to flooding. So does a particular measure match up with the geographic and morphologic setting in each of these sub-areas? And fourth, similarly aligned with the community value point, but important to make a point on its own, does the measure support and or improve existing recreational and ecological functions on the coast? Because that's a big driver of why people like to go to the coastline, so that was another important key. So this this table is hard to read, but it's provided in the handout, and it lists the individual adaptation measures. I'll read through a couple of examples. One could be setbacks for new development, beach nourishment, dune restoration, structural elevation like raising a road or a home, building seawalls and revetments, etc. And this table has the general pros and cons associated with each of these measures and the suitability based on the previous slide criteria for each sub-area. So we digested all the measures that we had and see how do they fit with each sub-area. So from this table, we came up with 3 alternatives for adaptation that include more than one or more individual measures. So, for example, an adaptation strategy could look like protecting the backshore by using engineering structures such as rock revetments by itself, or we could look at adding rock revetments or maintaining existing revetments and then nourishing the beach in addition. So, coming up with these alternatives from this table, we had 3 alternatives that are reasonable and realistic, in our opinion, to protect the coastline for each of the Pacifica sub-areas. So now I'm going to walk through each of the sub-areas and talk about what we've assembled for each to adapt to sea level rise and the associated flooding and erosion hazards. I'm going to go from north to south, and so we're starting with our most northern sub-area, Paramount West, and that's the undeveloped, generally undeveloped bluff up above the coastal developments and condos and ocean air and all of that. It's mostly open space, so we have a little bit more room to allow natural erosion processes to occur until infrastructure is impacted. So the first alternative that we looked at here is a combination of accommodate and protect. So we're accommodating for sea level rise and erosion by allowing erosion to proceed up the bluff and giving the landowners option to transfer their development rights to others to use elsewhere as a way to facilitate allowing erosion and maintaining existing armoring structures in this area. And so for this first alternative, we're assuming that the existing armor is maintained, but we allow erosion to occur until the infrastructure is threatened, and that infrastructure is Palmetto Avenue and a sewer line that is within the roadway. And so at that point, when coastal erosion threatens that road, under this alternative, we're assuming that armor will be built to maintain the flood condition and protect that roadway. The second alternative is to protect. And in protecting, we're doing a couple of things. We're maintaining those existing structures that exist, that are on the shore, and we're also adding beach nourishment to slow down the bluff erosion by providing an extra buffer against the back shore. By having a wide beach, you have less wave runoff, and that will limit the amount of erosion that occurs. So slowing down the erosion in the meantime through beach nourishment, but ultimately still protecting that facility, the roadway and sewer infrastructure when needed. The third option is a managed retreat. And under that alternative, we're also allowing erosion to proceed, and as Tina and others mentioned, this is an alternative that is being considered for all sub-areas at the direction of the Coastal Commission. And so you'll be seeing this for each sub-area. And so we're allowing erosion to proceed. The beach will generally be more maintained by allowing that backshore erosion to occur, and still assuming that existing structures are maintained here. And again, implementing those transfer of development rights from the parcels in this area so that erosion can be allowed. So let's move on down the coast to the West Edgemar and Pacific Manor sub-area. So as you can see, it's a pretty noticeable difference in the level of development on the bluff. We still have some pretty high bluffs here, so flooding isn't really the concern. It's coastal erosion. But we have a lot of existing development and existing revetments and other shore protected structures. And so our alternatives reflect that condition. The first alternative is to protect, and that's basically to maintain all of the existing coastal armor that exists on the shore, and to expand the coastal armoring when needed in areas that are currently not armored. So there's a couple of areas that let's see if I can get the later right. There's a couple areas that are not armored, and the city is actually planning on armoring a couple of these. So we're assuming that existing structures are maintained and unarmored bluffs are then protected with new armor, and those are maintained in the future. The second alternative, and the following few sub-areas follow this same pattern where we're having basically a solely armoring based protection strategy, and then another protection strategy that includes beach nourishment. So the second strategy, it says 3, that's a typo, it should say 2, and these are just numbered for the purpose of keeping track. It's not a prioritized scheme or anything like that. So the second strategy that we're looking at here is the same as strategy 1, maintain existing armoring structures, expand those structures where they don't exist, and also add beach nourishment. And beach nourishment does a couple of things. It provides space for recreation and ecology, so people and animals can go down and use that beach. And it also helps to provide a buffer of impacts on the back shore. So if we have got a wide beach that we maintain in front of the coastal armoring structures, we're going to need to invest less in those coastal armoring structures because their maintenance requirements will be a little less by having that beach. So the beach costs money, but it provides a few different benefits. So the second strategy, we're armoring everything and also adding a beach. And so that is assumed to occur immediately because there's a small beach right now. And we'll nourish that beach 500 feet and then re-nourish it based on the erosion. I'm just walking over to get a sip of water. Bear with me. Re-nourish that beach as needed to maintain a reasonable beach width that will help to provide both that recreation and buffer against the back shore. Okay. Third strategy is manage retreat. And as Tina mentioned, this is included at the request or the direction of the Coastal Commission for all of our sub-areas. So we're looking at what is the impact to basically retreat from the coast. And so it's optional to private property owners, as Tina mentioned. And under this scenario, we're basically assuming that everyone is, opting into this strategy. It's not assuming that it's going to occur or anything. It's for the purpose of this analysis to compare what it would look like. So looking at either abandoning existing structures or removing damaged structures when they're no longer effective, and allowing erosion of the back shore, and basically what's the cost of the property that's getting eroded, and what are the structures there, and what does it cost to basically demolish those structures. So this is all hypothetical here. Manage retreat, peeling back from the coastline, removing existing structures, abandoning armoring, or removing armor that is no longer effective, and allowing erosion. So the next sub area is northwest Shark Park. It's got some different privately owned land, almost entirely armored, and has the same three strategies. Same strategy means that I spoke about for the adjacent sub-areas to the north. So we're looking at protecting by maintaining all the existing armoring structures, expanding armoring structures where they don't exist. The second strategy is adding beach nourishment to that to maintain the beach and to reduce the maintenance requirements of those armoring structures. And the third alternative is manage retreat. One thing that I didn't mention for the previous one, for the beach nourishment strategy number 2, this also includes sand retention structures, which will help to maintain that nourished beach for a longer period of time. We thought that it would be effective for this northern reach of Pacifica, everything basically north of Mooring Point, to also have sand retention structures included as this beach nourishment strategy. So let's move on one more down to Shark Park, West Prairie Park, and Mooring Point. We've got a little bit more going on in this sub-area because the backshore transitions from some low bluffs to more low-lying backshore that's also subject to flooding. So our strategies include a few flooding management measures to help deal with that. So the first being protect. We're looking at the same strategy of maintaining the existing armoring structures. That includes the planned upgrades to the revetment or the retaining wall type structure north of the pier, and also maintaining the seawall south of the pier and extending that seawall to the San Francisco Golf Course levee that is currently a gap in the backshore and a flood pathway from the coastal side. And so under this strategy, we're also assuming that San Francisco, who owns and maintains the golf course and levee, that they will also be maintaining that levee in its condition and expanding the armoring and maintaining it there. And this the protect strategy also includes flood management of the adjacent neighborhoods and commercial areas to the golf course. This golf course is not just subject to flooding from the coast. It's a lagoon that's fed by freshwater flows from the watershed, and can flood during storm rain events. And so to deal with that, which could become worse with sea level rise, as part of our protection strategy, we have a couple of interior levees that will protect adjacent properties, both the most western part of West Prairie Bay Park with the stormwater detention basin and pump station, and as well as the levee proposed for the Clarendon side, which is already managed by a portable pump during storm events, and you might see that pipe running out along Clarendon. So basically, allowing for whatever San Francisco is going to do with the golf course to occur, but protecting the adjacent businesses and homes from flooding. The second strategy is also a protect strategy that includes the sand, beach nourishment and sand retention structures. as I mentioned, for the previous sub-areas in order to provide more recreation and ecological benefits as well as buffer the back shore. The third option, as we're considering, is retreat in the analysis, and that is to manage removal and relocation of assets, and like for the others, this is included at the request of the Coastal Commission. And so, into the future, as erosion would proceed, we'd be removing structures and buying property theoretically to facilitate that. Rockaway Cove has got a couple of different areas. It's got some headlands and tall bluffs, as well as a more low-lying and developed portion of the coast. And so the first strategy is a protect and accommodate hybrid adaptation strategy. And in that strategy, we're maintaining existing armoring structures that exist, and those are designated in the figure in that orange line. So we've got rock revetments built along the existing development. And so under this protect accommodate strategy, we're protecting where there's existing development, and we're accommodating by allowing some erosion to occur in the south area of the cove where there's not a lot of development, just a small parking lot and bathroom. And so allowing erosion to occur in this southern part of the cove, and ultimately assume that Caltrans would armor the Highway 1 embankment when that is threatened. And so under the strategy, we're under the protection strategy, we're not only just building new armoring where it doesn't exist, but into time we're maintaining the existing armoring structures. And so that's accomplished as part of our beach width modeling to track the beach width through time and determine when we need to be upgrading these coastal armoring structures. The second strategy for Rockaway Cove is similar to the first. We're okay, and so actually, when we go back to alternative one, I spoke about the cove. For the two undeveloped headlands, the strategy that we're looking at here, or considering as part of this strategy, is development setbacks for any new proposed development. Those would be sited in such a way that coastal erosion would not threaten those structures during their structural life. So moving on to alternative two, we're looking at the same, protecting the back shore where coastal armoring exists, and we've got some development, and adding beach nourishment to that. We identified Rockaway Cove as a really good candidate for beach nourishment because it's pretty well contained, and so that would be a great area to focus on beach nourishment. And because of its the relative confinement of this area, we're just proposing beach nourishment and not any additional sand retention structures, because we think that beach nourishment itself would be fairly effective here. So by nourishing the beach, we're adding some more recreational area for folks, and protecting or reducing the maintenance requirements of those existing armor, and also slowing the amount of erosion that would occur at the south coast, and delaying any need for further intervention to protect the highway. Similarly, including development setbacks for the undeveloped bluff portions. Again, we also have a retreat accommodate hybrid, where we would be removing coastal armoring and allowing erosion to occur, and also accommodating the coastal erosion with the bluffs with redevelopment setbacks. Closer to where we are right now, Pacifica State Beach is the next sub-area, and it primarily just includes the beach. It runs the sub-area boundary runs along Highway 1, but here we're just looking at the Pacifica State Beach area. And so our three alternatives take into consideration of the existing conditions. So we're looking at protect, with, that includes armoring and flood protection. So we'll be, under this first alternative, maintaining existing armoring structures, and assuming that new armor is built on private land south of the existing armoring when needed, as well as for pump stations, while allowing erosion of these northern dunes. And in the future, when erosion encroaches on the highway, we're also assuming that the highway would be armored. Funding to be determined, of course, but for the purpose of this analysis, assuming that the highway would be maintained. So over time, the beach and dunes would erode, and this highway would be armored when it's subject to erosion impacts, and also raised to limit the amount of wave overtopping that would occur further into the future with higher sea level rise amounts, to help protect the low-lying area where we actually are right now from flooding from the coast. And so, again, the timing of these actions is dependent on the observed erosion rates in this area and our modeling of the beach width through time. The second strategy here, similarly, retains the armoring approach, but in addition to that protection measure, we're also adding beach nourishment here. So, alternative number 2, maintaining existing armoring structures, building new armor when needed to protect other private and public facilities to the south end of the cove, and allowing erosion of those northern dunes. By adding beach nourishment to that, we're basically providing an additional buffer and delaying the needs for building new structures and reducing maintenance requirements. And so, in this strategy, in both strategies, there's a couple of key infrastructure that Mayor Keener mentioned earlier, which are the existing pump stations for not only the sewer but also stormwater pump stations that are on the beach. So, in the protect strategy, we're also including flood-proofing of those pump stations in place to continue to serve the community. Under the third adaptation alternative, which is a retreat protect hybrid, we're considering retreat back to the highway in essence. So what is the cost to relocate, pull back the parking and other structures that exist, and relocating those pump stations. But when erosion continues back to the highway, we're assuming that that would be armored and raised to maintain its position. So just inland of the Pacifica State Beach area where we're standing now is the West Linamar sub-area. And so this sub-area is technically not in the coastal zone, but is subject to flooding from San Pedro Creek. And with higher amounts of sea level rise, the area is vulnerable to worsened flooding from San Pedro Creek due to an elevated ocean boundary condition, as well as potential for wave runoff and overtopping of Pacifica State Beach and flooding of that area. So we've included it in this study because it's still going to have impacts potentially with sea level rise, and we thought it was a pertinent area to add into our analysis. So here we've just got two strategies we're looking at protect, and the strategies here in West Linamar are also tied to the Pacifica State Beach sub-area strategies. Like I mentioned, raising the highway will help to protect this low community, or low neighborhood from wave runoff and overtopping. So that's considered, they're kind of tied together. So for protect, we're assuming Caltrans will raise Highway 1 with armor when needed, and we're also considering a small flood wall along the business, this commercial area to help limit the amount of flooding potential from San Pedro Creek. And as also in the future, groundwater, this area is very low and already has some groundwater issues, and so as sea level rises, that groundwater will also rise, and so as part of the protection strategy, we're also including a pump station, or a series of groundwater management wells as needed to maintain that groundwater level and make sure that it's not an issue for landowners there. The alternative to this protect strategy would be to accommodate sea level rise. And so instead of fortifying everything in place, an accommodation strategy would look something like elevating structures in addition to groundwater management. So instead of just completely limiting flooding with additional structures on San Pedro Creek, we could look at elevating the homes in this community, or even something not included in this analysis, but an alternative to elevating structures would be to put them on floats. So in a flood, the home could lift up with the flood waters and then recede once that flood passes. But to manage day-to-day groundwater issues, we still include the groundwater management wells. So if there was a big storm and you had everyone on floats, their homes could float up and we would have a miniature Venice situation for a few days here. But either we're protecting in place or accommodating the flooding by allowing structures to be elevated, or it could look like something different, such as putting them on floats. So our last sub-area is the Pedro Point and Shelter Cove sub-area. It includes a small portion of beach that's connected to Pacifica State Beach. And so some of the alternatives have some linkages with what measures are taken at Pacifica State Beach. The protect strategy, number one for this, or I should say alternative strategy for this sub-area is to assume that we're going to maintain the private armoring structures that exist and expand armoring as needed to protect existing development on the shore and headland here. And so basically to protect everything with armoring. Alternative two is a protect and accommodate hybrid. So here we're looking at the existing structures being maintained and expanded to protect existing structures, but also including elevating structures here that could be subject to a wave runout. So there's some homes down here that would could benefit from having the option to elevate, and also adding beach nourishment it's not calculated directly for this sub-area, but it is added as part of the Pacific State beach nourishment alternative. Similarly to the other areas, we also have a retreat alternative 3 at the request of the Coastal Commission, which includes giving the option to property owners to remove or abandon existing armoring and retreating from the coastline as erosion occurs. So all of these sub-areas, or all of these strategies that were looked at for these sub-areas, we developed new hazard zones that match up with what these actions are. For a managed retreat scenario, we just have erosion proceeding, but for strategies such as protect, we're limiting that amount of erosion because we're assuming that we're going to be building armoring or nourishing the beach. So new hazard zones are produced to represent all of these alternatives for each sub-area, and then from those different changes in hazard exposure, we can calculate what the impacts are associated with each of these hazards, or each of these alternatives, and then also develop cost estimates for how much these alternatives are going to cost. And so I'd like to now talk briefly about where we're at with this economic analysis. And so right now we've basically overlaid using GIS the new hazards for each adaptation strategy with all the parcel data and other infrastructure data like sewer pipelines, other roadways, structures, important infrastructure facilities like pump stations, et cetera, to generate the impacts associated with each of these alternative strategies. Excuse me. And so we're also still in the process of refining our estimates on residential, government, and the land and structures associated with residential and government properties. We're working up the benefits of beach recreation, which are most significant, as you can see today, just across the street at Pacifica State Beach. A little note is that nourishment will be needed to support recreation at Pacifica State Beach, but because we've got such a wide beach, our modeling indicates that we may not really need much nourishment until after 2050. And we're still evaluating the cost to manage retreat. Our initial pass, we've looked at the impacts, but we're thinking about how to include some other costs that aren't necessarily included yet in our analysis, like the administrative costs or legal costs to implement something like managed retreat. So we're still refining the costs associated with managed retreat, and the full economic analysis will also include sales and transient occupancy taxes, the losses associated with flooding of those particular revenues. And it'll also include the sales and transient occupancy taxes associated with beach recreation. So we're still working on the economic analysis, as City Manager pointed out, and so we'll be refining these different pieces of the economic analysis over the next month, and that'll all be included in the final draft of the adaptation plan. So next steps for the economic analysis. We're going to complete the cost-benefit analysis by making sure all of our shoreline change modeling is properly tuned and reviewed. That provides us the timing for adaptation strategies, like when we need to be upgrading armoring structures or the frequency of beach nourishment needed to maintain a beach. Using those modified hazard maps to get the picture of what the new hazard exposure is, given a different adaptation strategy. And from that, we're estimating the damages and costs and incorporating that information into the adaptation plan. Once we get a good picture of what different strategies look like in terms of cost and benefit, we're in the adaptation plan, we'll be providing some near-term adaptation priorities that are based on the city and public input throughout this project so far, the vulnerabilities that we've identified through vulnerability assessment. And so it'll include priority places to get started. Where should we get started and focus our efforts on adaptation? What's vulnerable now that needs the most attention? So that those types of near-term priorities will be included, and all work together into the final draft adaptation plan, which we'll be posting later. From that, we'll then get into the drafting sea level rise policies that will help to implement these preferred strategies, adaptation strategies, and these will also be reviewed at subsequent worker meetings and another public workshop. So overall project next steps, what are we looking at? So we're going to complete and release the final draft adaptation plan. We'll continue to be accepting written comments, and the comment period will last until 30 days after the release of the final draft. So you guys have the initial draft here and have the opportunity to provide input now, and we'll continue to have that opportunity for a month after we release the final adaptation plan. You can fill out a comment card today to provide oral comment or question. Right here at this meeting, you can fill out a comment form to be submitted to the city and logged in the project. And you can also send comments to the city's email, sealevelrise@ci.pacifica.ca.us. You can also go log on to the city's website, and all this information is also provided there. And our next public meeting to discuss the final draft adaptation plan is scheduled for August 11th right here. And now it's time where we open up for public comment and questions. So if you've got I guess I'll turn it over to Kelsey, she's better facilitating this.
Yeah, we'll give you a break from talking for a second. So I have 4 question cards. So and you raise your hand and Bonnie will come around and collect them. Before we get going into public comment, I wanted to give a couple quick updates. First of all, we're early on the agenda, so we have a little bit more time for public comment and Q&A, so you're definitely encouraged to fill out the question card if you have a thought or any questions. I will be keeping, so I'll have my phone. I'm not waiting for an important call. I'm just going to be kind of keeping time, so we try to have comments go for 2 minutes. If you have a question, I'll just kind of be monitoring. I think generally we'll try to go back and have the speaker have a chance to ask the question, maybe a follow-up question, and then give staff an opportunity to answer once or twice. So I'll just be kind of trying to move us along through that, but won't be keeping the exact 2 minutes on the questions. Also, if you have a question and I read off your name. It sounded a little staticky too. Is this better? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, so if I read off your name and you have a question and you want me just to read it, assuming I can speak into the microphone clearly, just let me know and I can do that. And I'll also read the next couple speakers, so you're given the heads up if that is your time to speak. Lastly, I wanted to note, so we've been mentioning the difference between the blue question card versus being able to provide oral comment and then the larger comment form. The comment form, if you submit that, your written comment, that is considered as part of the public comment, as official public comment. Any oral comments, Matt's taking great notes, and we'll try to, we won't be capturing that verbatim, so I just wanted to note that as well. I think that was it on the kind of the heads up on public comment. And I will, apologies in advance if I mispronounce your name, I'll do my best. But first up, we have Ron McHell, and then I have Jim Steele, followed by Gordon Tamura. So Ron?
Yes.
You're back here. Okay, I'll come bring you the mic. I'll grab my phone in time. Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to make I have one question and a comment that both have to do with design. And actually, the comment is really more for the council members here, those of you that are. And it has to do with, they're going to have the final say before they go to commission. The coastal, I'm going to get into it.
Oh, no.
I don't know if I pushed the wrong button.
That's what. Nope. Testing? No? Okay.
It's got to be the ever-ready batteries. At any rate, for council, having a say, the cultural commission will have the final say. But I just hope that the council is making every effort possible to check out designs, not just in California, but worldwide. I'm just under the impression that other countries, especially the Netherlands, and other countries in Europe and around the world, are using very innovative, creative designs in dealing with this issue. So I hope we just don't get locked into a boulder armoring and concrete wall mentality. That's all. Let's just get creative. Hopefully we have time to continue this to where we can come up with some creative ideas. Lastly, I just had a question. I've been in contact with someone from the Coastal Conservancy, and I guess they're in the process of rerouting. They're trying to establish the coastal trail here in Pacifica, and I just hope that the city and also the SA is working with the Coastal Conservancy in regards to any type of rerouting that might have to be done in respect to sea level rise. And that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next up is Jim Steele.
I'm shy. You're not hitting on me, are you? You really want me to go up? Dang. All right. And I stopped running, so I'm going to have to say a little more. Adaptations must consider different possible scenarios. The low-risk estimate in our package by 2050 suggests a 1 foot, which is equivalent of 300 millimeter rise by 2050. But SF tide gauges show just 1 millimeter a year rise since 1980, meaning less than 2 inches rising by 2050. Now, the Antarctic research community is split 50-50 on how much changes in Antarctica are natural versus CO2. And changes in Antarctica are what are driving these estimates. Now, what my concern is if we go by the best case scenario and say the sea level just keeps rising the way it is now at around 1 millimeter, we could choose an adaptation strategy that means you just pay as you go, because it's not going to be that dramatic. If we look at the other hypothesis that's equally possible, that maybe it's going to be 10 feet rise, then you might want to choose a more extreme adaptation process. And my fear is if we don't know which way it's going to go, and I don't want people jumping on the most extreme and say, well, it'll be too expensive that we keep paying when we go, and then eventually we have to pay all this money. So I was asking, what is an example of how we could change adaptation strategies as we go? I think the north part of Pacifica has to be fixed no matter what. It's going to be independent of sea level rise. It's weak geology, and from what I read in the Tribune, we're already working on a seawall there. How much money we go to help one place versus another here at Lindemar, do we spend a whole lot of money raising Highway 1 by 10 feet when that might not have to happen? So how do we go pay as you go, and then when's the trigger points, and what kind of adaptation strategy will allow us to fluidly deal with sea level as we find out which hypotheses really turn out to be true?
Okay, the next couple ones, we have Gordon Tenura, followed by Allison West, followed by Lori.
I'd like to address Jim's comment really quick, and something I didn't get into more details on during the presentation. But as I mentioned, for the purpose of working up the costs and what the adaptation would look like, we're looking at the high sea level rise scenario. But the triggers, as Jim pointed out, are defined on observable changes, amounts of bluff erosion that actually occur, the amount of sea level rise that has actually occurred. And so as far as implementing and moving forward with adaptation here in Pacifica, actions will be based on observable trigger points and will not be assuming any amount of the extreme sea level rise. So for the example of the Highway 1, that Highway 1 will need to be armored and raised accordingly depending on the actual erosion that we experience on Pacifica State Beach, as well as the amount of sea level rise that actually occurs. And so these triggers are specified in the draft adaptation plan, and that's how we'll move forward with adapting to sea level rise here, just to answer that comment. So thanks, Jim, that's a good point.
Right, Gordon?
Do you hear me okay? Gordon Tenura, and I'm a member of the community work group, so I've been involved in this since the beginning of the year. And watching as a number of these documents, et cetera, and we have these meetings, which are great. And it's a little hard to decipher exactly what's going to come out as a result of this, at least in my mind. I know that there are something called policies that will be produced as a result of this plan. I don't know like. I think we'll all be interested when they come out. So I thought that perhaps we could bring more of this to life if we took a recent example. And that Chip mentioned that the seawall, just briefly, in the north end of town, I think was announced in the Tribune this last week. Mentioned a revetment and a seawall. Didn't mention some of the other alternatives that were defined for that particular area, at least in the report so far, like sand retention structures or replenishment. So I wondered if we could maybe have a discussion about that decision and that how we're moving forward today on a seawall, strategies around that. What was considered, what was the economic analysis or other analysis that were performed for that selection? What are the implications on risks for private property adjoining it as to any erosion that may result? Just I think that the elaboration of that and putting it in reference to how we might implement what's being proposed here would be a benefit to us now and going forward.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think for the interest of time, I might try to run out and bring the mics to you. But if it is hard to see, we'll try to make folks a little more centered for folks, if that's okay. So next up we have Allison West, followed by Lori, followed by Roy Stotts.
Yeah, so just in response to Gordon, so our city engineer isn't here. I think that it's a good question, a good point, and perhaps a case study potentially for discussion in the future. And I don't know if our city manager wanted to say anything more about that particular project.
Yeah, sure. The project that was referred to that was written up in the Tribune is the 400 block of Esplanade, and that is a emergency response revetment that's being done and is 90% or more grant funded from state and federal sources. And the emergency about that is that the recent storms have carved out a cove along there that is threatening the infrastructure in Esplanade Road. So it's really important to act immediately to curb that erosion that may happen, and that's the rationale and the justification for doing that. And it's public property facing public infrastructure right there, not private. Yeah, Esplanade Road has sewer. It has North Coast water and probably telecommunications infrastructure. Plus, it's the roadway that allows access to properties.
Okay, thank you. Okay, are you Allison?
Allison Adeline.
Oh, Allison, I saw you move up. Maybe she's Allison. Okay. So we'll take, well, she had a question, so maybe I'll just read it so it's captured here. Why aren't you considering using undeveloped land for mitigation measures in Pedro Point? This needs to be included in the strategies. To kind of say if you want to respond or we'll just capture it. Cool. Okay, so next up is Lori, followed by Roy Stotts, followed by Stan Zarin. So Lori, right there. Oh.
I'm just concerned with the cost of everything. The sewer project over here was, I think, $18 million, and now it's overrun. They said about $10 million. So the property tax in Pacifica is so expensive that you're driving seniors out, and I'm just afraid that this is going to be millions and millions of dollars on our taxes.
Thank you. Next up, Roy. Oh, okay.
So I think, I think it was a misconception because every time it was mentioned today during the presentation that Better?
Yeah.
Sorry. Every time managed retreat was mentioned, mentioned it was because of, at the request of the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission, to the best of my knowledge, basically just advises and gives guidelines. It does not, it cannot make us do this. And I refer you right now to the city of Del Mar, which is in Southern California. The homeowners there basically said just the mention of planned retreat would severely impact their property values in any future potential sale of their home. That exact same thing will happen in Pacifica if any mention of managed retreat is anywhere, because it would have to be disclosed by the realtors when they're ready to sell your house. So if you don't think it's going to affect your property, it will. Also, based on the stakeholder input that they did in Del Mar, by the way, and they removed any reference to managed retreat. And they indicated that the adaptation plan, which must be certified by the California Coastal Commission, is consistent with the Coastal Act, and that's according to their staff report. So the other thing that they talk about, again, this is published newspaper, May of this year. The data supports the conclusion that Del Mar's proposed approach is science-based and feasible to meet public and private goals through the middle of the century. I think going forward, we need to remove any references to managed retreat. We're just going down the rabbit hole.
I would take this opportunity to talk a little bit more because I think there's some misconceptions about sort of our role in this. And part of the reason we're asking for managed retreat to be analyzed here is because it's required by their grant agreement. So that is one piece of this. A little bit more broadly, managed retreat, we ask sort of cities and jurisdictions to look at managed retreat because at the Coastal Commission and in turn different jurisdictions are required by law to ensure protection of coastal resources. That includes beaches, that includes all of these habitat and access areas, and it does include balancing sort of development along with that. And it has always been sort of a resource conflict there about how do we balance both development and our environment. That has always been the case. That will be even more so the case as sea levels rise, because in order to protect development, it means we have to use armoring. And if we have armoring as sea levels rise, we will lose beaches. That is just what happens. And so part of this is just trying to understand what are the different resource conflicts and what are the best options for avoiding those. And so managed retreat from our perspective is the best option to ensure that we can manage and protect beaches and other resources. Now, at this point in time, we are not saying that Pacifica needs to choose a strategy that relies on managed retreat that starts tomorrow. Nothing in this is saying that we want houses to be abandoned tomorrow. What this is saying is at this sort of initial stage, we're looking at a variety of strategies to determine what is the best balance of strategies to determine the best balance of how we can protect all of these different resources. So I think there's some misconceptions about the Del Mar case that I'm not going to speak to because I think that article is also, there's some misconceptions in there. We don't approve adaptation plans in and of themselves. Adaptation plans are just a planning exercise to start to inform LCP policies, which is the next step. And we approve LCPs. So I think there's a little bit of confusion both with Del Mar, but more broadly, I just sort of wanted to say that's why we're talking about managed retreat, is because we really want to understand what would it mean to ensure protection of beaches. But the strategies that Pacifica chooses, that's a little bit down the line, just in terms of how that actually gets folded together.
Thank you, Kelsey. I will ask if you have any questions to please fill out a question card. Thank you. Okay, next up, Stan Zirin, followed by Margaret Goodale, and followed by Gina Zeri. So Stan, are you still here? Okay, I'll come over to you.
Well, excuse the paper, but my short-term memory isn't as good as it used to be. A couple of studies I've seen the last couple of weeks. Thank you. A couple of studies I've read the last couple of weeks are certainly up for concern. From the Union of Concerned Scientists and others, studies have shown that the west shelf of the Antarctica is melting at twice the rate it was melting in the 1990s. Also from that article on Del Mar, the California Ocean Protection Council, which is a state agency, suggested that Del Mar plan for a 7.1 rise in sea level by the end of the century. What that is saying is that's 2 times greater than over the last 5 or 10 years that this number has gone up. So it's something of concern. Lastly, in this week's Chronicle, the Union of Concerned Scientists, from a report with detailed evaluations of properties nationwide, quote, currently the real estate market largely doesn't account for the near and medium-term risk, which means a lot of coastal property is effectively overvalued. Some form of a market correction is inevitable as people's perceptions of flood risk catch up with the reality. And from Alice Hill, a research fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, this is a very conservative think tank, states, quote, with this issue, they can't stay in their homes. They will walk away and move, and those properties will be valueless. And with this in mind, what I'd like to suggest, and I want to jump on what Tina was talking about earlier, but expand a little bit. From what I've seen, it's only going to get worse in terms of money. And whereas we could use this money to protect the homes now from 10 to 20 years, I'm sorry, from 20 to 40 years, excuse me. I would like to point out that all these studies only get bigger, they never get smaller. And I think that it would be a really good idea to take a look at moving the homes and just put that money once to protecting them, so when everybody dies, which we will do, you will have a piece of property to pass down to your people and you won't have to walk away with nothing. This is, there are other ideas, I just want to put this out there. I think that I know nothing or very little about how this would even happen. The economic costs and the physical problems I wouldn't even begin to address, but I would just like to see it on the table. For those of you with your property and you think that maybe you will eventually have to walk away, there are alternatives, and the best chance to get money for them would be sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Margaret, good afternoon. Right next door.
All right. My question is to Phil, and that is, how is the economic analysis dealing with that reality of property values getting lower as properties are more threatened, as the risks increase?
That's a great question. I wish I could give you a great answer. We're looking at property values as they are today, given today's market rates. That's the best we can do. But I would agree that property values are going to change depending on what happens in the coastal world, whether we have very high rates of erosion or very slow rates of erosion. I'm not going to weigh in on that today, given the controversy, but those would definitely impact the value of houses. I have a house in Sacramento, rental property, that's lowered in value because of a flood risk. So those things do occur, but we're looking at the values in our economic analysis as they are today. I'm not saying that's the perfect assumption, but that's the best assumption we can make.
Great, thank you. Okay, next up, Gina Zeri. Gina? Hi, can everybody hear me? Yeah. Gina Zari, Government Affairs Director for the San Mateo County Association of Realtors, whose mission it is to defend homeowners and their property rights. So we've done a really robust job of trying to get people to be aware of this topic, aware that it's happening in their community, but to include managed retreat or condemnation of homes or restriction of homes, to take away property rights without the community fully aware of what's going on will cause tremendous problems in the future.
There are some extremely well-intentioned, very bright staff members, both city and coastal commission and consultant working on this. And managed retreat is something that is, to most people, when you tell them, even in Pacifica, the vast majority of people don't know what managed retreat is. When you tell them what it is, they think you're joking. So to include any mention of managed retreat in Pacifica's LCP without the full knowledge of the community is going to be a problem. So I think it should be removed in every instance, and it's a good conversation to start having. Should something happen 10 years from now, 20 years in the future, that's a conversation that we definitely need to have. But at this moment, the conversation should begin, and it's a good thing that it's beginning, and I'm happy that the management retreat has been brought to the forefront and we've been discussing it. But it's premature until you have a room full of 1,000 people, then maybe we can start talking about it then. Thank you.
Okay, the next couple up, we have Bruce Berry, followed by Richard Harris, followed by Cindy Abbott. So Bruce.
Hi, I'm Bruce Berry. Some of you may know me, most of you probably don't. I live in Cedar Point, and I just had a question. We have a low point in our neighborhood, which we call the Howson Field. It's prone to flooding already, and I was wondering if this specific area has been addressed in the LCP, and how would you go about mitigating that, or would you just allow flooding to happen in that area?
So the Kelson property is private property in Cedar Point, and it hasn't been singled out any differently than any other private property. I think that's the best answer to you.
Great, thank you. Richard, you're up next, followed by Cindy.
Thank you. I'm Richard Harris. I'm a spokesman for the Public Golf Alliance, which has been focusing on issues at the golf course, but the golf course issues relate as well to its neighbors. And this is a question directed to Dr. King, having to do with the economic valuation. Today's draft plan says on page 44 that the economics will be analyzed as they were set out in a May 4 memorandum from Dr. King. That May 4 memorandum at one point said that beach recreation will be measured based on $40 a day for each beach user, and it was stated in Dr. King's report that this was somehow mandated or required by the Coastal Commission, and he cited a report that he said was from the Coastal Commission. I have drafted a letter after I took 3 weeks to get that report. And in fact, the Coastal Commission rejected a $40 per day or any specific amount per day for beach recreation valuation. I've set that out in detail in a letter dated June 8th. And my question is that $40 per day still going to be used, notwithstanding the documentation in my June 8 letter, or will that June 8 letter be considered and the facts as set forth in that letter be considered in the analysis?
This one doesn't have a battery, so I think I don't have to worry. I'm going to consider everything that's submitted, all of the comments. As of now, I do plan to use $40 a day. That's supported by the best available economics and science. It was supported by the Coastal Commission in Solana Beach as well, although you could argue that is a different case, but that's what I intend to use. $40 a day I think is very reasonable. You look at Pacifica State Beach, right now I had trouble parking here today because everybody was at the beach. And we also have a number of studies indicating that surfing is a higher level activity in terms of willingness to pay. Now, you may or may not agree with that, but the economic science basically says surfing is a higher value activity. It's harder to find good surf spots, et cetera, et cetera. There are a lot of surfers out there. So I think $40 a day is very reasonable. I'm sure, I'm 100% sure that there will be discussion about that once the report comes out, but I do plan to use that number, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm noticing you might have follow-up questions or comments as you're hearing from the team and as you hear other people's comments or questions. I will ask you to fill out another form so I can kind of keep track and make sure that folks who have another chance, who have a chance to speak before we kind of go around again, if that makes sense. Okay, so next up is Cindy Abbott. Was directly related to that?
Yes. Is it $40 a day because that has been the guidance of the Coastal Commission, or is that based on something other than what you reported in your May 4 letter as guidance of the Coastal Commission?
Well, ultimately, it's based on travel cost and other economic studies. So that's the ultimate basis for it.
I'm Cindy Abbott, and I'm a West Shore Park resident, and I'm also a member of the community working group. And I'd like to say I agree with Ron Maple that a lot of the ideas for protection and accommodation seem to be very old-fashioned. You know, they're armoring and putting in jetties, things that have shown over the years since humans have been trying to fight off nature, that just end up having impact further down the coast. So I do hope that as we progress, and I know that some of these ideas are still new, but Ron brought up the Netherlands. We're here talking about, property. In the Netherlands, they're letting things flood. They're saying, let's not protect some areas. If we do have open spaces, let's let that happen and not try to build our way and construct our way out of it. So I'd like to see more of those types of things put into the ideas that are being presented here. And I really appreciate hearing from the Coastal Commission about managed retreat and the importance of beginning conversations to talk about it today. I would welcome a day when we have 1,000 people here in Pacifica at a meeting, but it's hard to get everybody to come out and to talk. And we just, there's many ways to take part. It's online, it's here in public. So the community does have the opportunity to speak out. But it's important that we start talking about managed retreat now, because we're not talking about retreat. We're talking about managed retreat, which might be 75 years in the future. We don't know what that might be. So, but, time does pass quickly. So I just wanted to say that I think that that's really important that we understand. No one's saying abandon West Shark Park tomorrow. We're talking about how to manage it so that when we have situations like what goes on up in northern Pacifica, we don't have the extremely high expense that it takes to do things in an emergency. It costs a lot more to do things in an emergency than it does to plan. So I just want to remember managed is in front of that conversation. And right now there's no timing for that. As Jane said, it says to be determined based on a series of triggers that might happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Cindy. Okay, next up we have Samuel Castillas, followed by Amy Kaplan, followed by Connie, who I saw I submitted, so I know you where you are. Okay, Samuel.
Hi, Sam Casillas. I'm a resident of Pedro Point. I'm also a member of the community group as well, and a few other groups in Pacifica. So one of the things that I heard earlier, actually, do you have any comment cards?
Oh, yes,
Well, I'll just clarify from here, but you know, there was sort of again this dialogue on global warming and climate change and how serious it is or not. And I guess the latest now is to try to pretend that it's not as serious and put some alternative facts out there. So just wanted to let everybody know that in the National Academy of Science in February, I'll read the statement here from NASA. A recent study looked at 25 years of NASA and European satellite data and figured out that the global sea levels aren't just rising, they're rising dramatically. The study, Climate Change-Driven Accelerated Sea Level Rise, detected in the altimeter area, published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences February, shows that the ice in Greenland and Antarctica is melting so quickly that it has the potential to double the total sea level rise projected by 2100. So that's one thing. Next thing is, of course, is when we start talking about, and Cindy, thank you for bringing it up, and Bruce, and I think Allison brought it up as well, is we have to look at some of these properties that are undeveloped. That includes the quarry, that includes the field in Pedro Point, and say, okay, they're undeveloped now, why are we going to develop them? They're low-lying areas. The fact is that if you do start doing a lot of infill in there, what it's going to do, and this was a lesson we should have learned from Houston, where they filled in all their wetlands and what have you, is that just pushed water out into other areas. So what you're actually doing by building where there's undeveloped property is pushing that water out to other areas. Finally, this whole question of managed retreat. I've been on this community group now and understand that. Again, it's like a plan A, B, and C. Let's remember, we used to connect to the Farallon Islands, okay? So, and now, more recently, we saw those apartments fall into the ocean and those two other houses. That's not gonna stop, and I don't care how much you try or millions you spend on that, that's going to happen. So do we wanna plan for it, or it's just gonna happen anyway? So it's better to plan for it. Let's manage that problem. And I believe that if people actually did look at the science and look at the way the plan is doing instead of some of this fear mongering that's going on, that we would actually educate ourselves on what managed retreat is and the fact that it's necessary and needed.
Thank you. Hey, Amy Kaplan?
Okay, since we're talking about like far off in the future-ish, first of all, my understanding is that managed retreat contingencies is required by the California Coastal Commission. Is that correct? That, like, do we have to provide these? Anyways, I don't know. Anyway, so that's what I thought, that like the Coastal Commission was sort of insisting that we include that in our local coastal plan. But anyway, so my comment is about planning for drought. And so what I wrote was, given that sea level rise is only one aspect of climate change, I would like the city to just, in the back of their minds, remember that extreme drought is forecasted for California and that water is going to be the most critical need for survival. And asking the city to keep the potential for the dreaded desalinization plant option open, and just sort of like in the back of their minds in planning, like where would we put this on the coast if California did run out of water and if we needed to desalinate to have water here in Pacifica. And also keeping in mind that, you know, that process would take up to 20 years to sort of consider and do environmental impact reports and build. And, you know, while we're going to geoengineer the coast, you know, where might a desalination plant have to go if, you know, no water was coming into the Bay Area from the Sierras or whatever. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay, next up is Connie.
You need your card on you.
Hi, my name is Connie Menifee, and I too am on the CWG, the work group. And, you know, I hear Sam make allegations of fear-mongering, but when I read the next to the last paragraph in the Coastal Commission's June 12th letter to the city, I got pretty alarmed. There's some scary language here, such that I have a couple of questions to direct to Kelsey. Number one, what is the consequence of failure to include managed retreat in the city's LCP? And then secondly, referring to this second to the last paragraph on page 2 of the Commission's June 12th letter to Tina and the city, how should the city put property owners on notice that retreat and relocation may be necessary so as to mitigate potential legal exposure?
Hi, yeah. Sorry, what was the first? The first part was how much of the requirement? Okay,
Of
sure.
failure to include, which I tell you, I quibble, looking at all the language in,
Right.
you know, if they're called interpretive guidelines.
Yeah.
Suggests, recommends, considers.
Absolutely,
I see
so
no mandatory language.
Right, yeah, so this is sort of similar to the question I think you had. And that's kind of a slight difference that I was trying to get at. Right now, we are asking the city to include it in their adaptation plan because it was required by their grant, and because, like I said, we want to sort of evaluate all these different options. We should be, we should think big at this point in time. Once it comes to the LCP, the requirements are to be in line with the Coastal Act. And like I said, that is a balancing of protecting different coastal resources. So what we would want to see is that there's some thought around how the city is going to be able to protect a variety of coastal resources over time. And so that's why I think managed retreat is an option. It's likely an option that's would only be necessary over the very long term if we have these sort of 10 foot of sea level rise over the long term. But like we've sort of been saying, we're thinking about triggers so that we can sort of understand when different strategies would need. So the LCP policies aren't necessarily going to have to say we are going to retreat from these X areas. What we do want to see is we want to be able to protect houses here when that comes into conflict with beach resources or sort of whatever. This is how we're going to address that conflict sort of over the entire city. So when
the commission reject or refuse to certify the LCP if it is not included?
I can't speak to what the commission does. They make their own decisions. Generally, what I'm sort of trying to get at, and it's hard to do this in policy language, is to figure out how to strike that right balance of protecting different resources over time. Because the development decisions we made today, houses are going to be here in 75 years. So some of this, maybe it sort of helps to sort of say, managed retreat isn't a singular strategy. It's an approach to ensure protection of different resources that can include a lot of different strategies. So in the short term, for new development, that means siting development out of harm's way. It means one of the ways that this kind of gets to your second question. One of the ways we do at the commission is when we do allow development in a place that doesn't seem hazardous for the near future or the medium to long-term future, but could become hazardous. We have conditions on those saying, this is a hazardous location, may become hazardous. Homeowners or property owners should be aware of this hazard and that you are on notice that you might have to do something. That could be elevation, that could be retreat over the very long term, that could be sort of participating in a different community adaptation strategy to address that hazard. Putting people on notice now when they're making their decisions is the way to avoid any kind of legal concern down the line when there's water out their door and they have to do something about it. You don't want them to be able to say, you said I was in a safe area. You want them to know that there's hazards down the line. That was a lot. I can't give you a straight answer on what the commission will or will not do. The point is to try and think broadly about how to balance these different resource conflicts and make sure we're thinking a little bit more proactively, not just sort of on the ground right today. Thank you. Okay, next up we have Michelle Velez, Victor Carmichael, and then Robin Reneel. So Michelle.
Hi, my name is Michelle Velez, and I am the incoming Government Affairs Chair for the California Association of Mortgage Professionals. And what I want to do is I just want to tell you a story. one of my loan officers was helping a client who was purchasing a property in Montero. There is a setback similar to a managed retreat. There's a setback that went through the house. And the underwriter looked at that and said, you know, we can't lend on this property because of this setback. The insurance company said we can't insure this property because of this setback. So the borrower had to get out of the contract. The thing of it is that when you're considering all options, consider the fact that lenders or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac will not lend on a property that has a deed restriction or managed retreat attached to it. I'm just asking you to consider all options, please.
Okay, next one is Victor. Front.
I think one of the key issues here is when the numbers come in, when this is all costed out, we'll see what is really happening. Now, we're facing like three alternatives, like a bronze, silver, and gold. And my feeling is that we very much need to build flexibility in this thing. The whole problem is that we don't know how much this stuff's going to cost. I know globally we're running out of sand. Sand, we're assuming that we'll be able to get sand out of Sierra Nevada. Other parts of the Bay Area are going to need that same sand. The sand's going to cost a fortune. The revetment's not so much, but it's still expensive. But the problem is it's a lost cause. As soon as the sand washes out, then it needs to be put back. And the East Coast has gone through this already, and they're ahead of us on the sea level rise. So my feeling is that we definitely need to be more adaptive. However, whatever that takes, and not to block out the possibility of a very serious situation in the next, probably not even in our lifetime. But I know from working with the local coastal plans, they have a certain rigidity. And once something's built in the local coastal plan, everything depends on it as far as property values and as far as development. And so when something gets into the local coastal plan that is not part of what the community really is good for the community, then in the long term it's going to be detrimental. So I just hope we have enough sense to be flexible about this. The other thing I wanted to ask is the free alternatives. Do we have to settle on one alternative, or is there a possibility of having more of a range built into the local coastal plan?
Yeah, I'll address that last part by reiterating the purpose of the alternatives analysis, which is to compare a reasonable number of available alternatives for adapting to sea level rise. If one seems to win, quote unquote, gets the gold medal based on the cost, that doesn't mean that the city is going to chase that one and go forward into the future. It's merely, the analysis is merely to provide an indication of how much these types of strategies will cost in the future, and to inform the city and the consulting team on what priority areas we need to focus on and what are the types of policies that we need to consider to start adapting. And by definition, it will be an adaptive process with the ability to change with time. And we're not going to choose the best alternative based on our analysis. The analysis is to give us a good picture of how much things cost and to help inform us on where we need to focus our efforts today, and it gives some indication on how things might change in the future if sea level rise continues.
Great, thank you. Okay, next up is Robin. I have Robin, then Marian Neihart, and then Jim Seal. Those are my last three cards. So if there's any additional comments or questions, feel free to fill out a card.
Hi, Robin O'Neill's longtime resident of West Shore Park. My question has to do with James' part of the presentation around the golf course, but first I wanted to respond to Victor and thank Ron Makel for reminding us that there are other places in the world that have been doing incredible things much, much longer than this. The Netherlands, for instance, it's been going on for over 700 years, and they've been reclaiming land from the sea. Also, the Netherlands is #1 in beach nourishment and movement of sand. Research what's been going on there. They have incredible beaches, totally created, natural-looking, wonderful places, big tourist attractions, environments maintained simply because of the movement of sand. So check out what the Netherlands is doing, and I hope ESEA looks into it also. James, in your presentation, you talked about Sharp Park and the creation of berms. Berms that would, and I'm assuming dirt berms, like, well, I guess what the golf course is using, the levee, on the perimeter of the golf course adjacent to the Sharp Park neighborhood and also Fairway Park to, I believe, to address the issue of flooding. And my question is, and it also has to do with, I've been hearing the discussion of berms from maybe not your organization, but from Mr. Vitalio for almost 15 years now, and he was working with San Francisco regarding the lawsuit over the golf course, trying to get the golf course, I guess, shut down and the levee reduced and allowing it to flood. When I and many of my neighbors showed up to these meetings and said, well, gee, if you do that, what's going to happen to us? Because we live right next to the golf course. And at that time, we were being told, we'll do berms. So berms have come back into the discussion over a long period of time. Also at that time, it was through managed retreats, so that was part of what they were presenting also to us. My question is, why are you suggesting a berm, a dirt berm, in that instance in Sharp Park Golf Course when down here in Lindemar you're suggesting a flood wall from the creek? Would not a wall maybe in both instances be more effective, maybe engineered better and less of a profile to, especially in our neighborhood, to sort of like being more aesthetic? So I guess my question just had to do with what's the benefit of a dirt berm over the concrete wall that you're recommending to go around the shopping center for our neighborhoods, similar to the flood wall suggested that you're talking about here around the shopping center adjacent to San Pedro Creek. Thank you.
So I'll just address why we chose the dirt berm for Sharp Park. There's a very limited space adjacent to the commercial area here along San Pedro Creek. And due to that limited space, it seemed a more realistic measure to construct a flood wall there. There's more space available around the golf course, and so we decided to look at this berm and stormwater detention basin concept as an alternative there. That's not to say that we are not recommending that a wall or a different feature be used. Like I said earlier, it's merely we have to pick something, and it made sense because there's available space, and it would address the issue. I didn't cost out what it would cost to build a wall, but I can understand that a wall would potentially be more expensive depending on the design conditions. So we're looking at this as an alternative to reduce the flooding risk, and how that ends up being constructed or potentially considered. It could take a different form. It could be a wall. It could be whatever the best available alternative is when that issue is looked into more detail.
Marianne Neihart, and I just wanted to make a few comments. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to ESA and the process, because what I've seen up here is very thorough and considers a lot of different options, and I appreciate that. I would also like to thank our community for actually taking this on, because as you can see, it's a thorny issue that has a lot of impacts on individual constituents and their own personal priorities. It has impact on values in our homes and values in our business. It has impact, without a doubt, to the scenic nature and the recreational value of our community. There's no doubt about it. So balancing those, as you discussed with the Coastal Commission, is a priority. I would like to see a little more discussion of exactly what Ron Maple talked about, not just in mechanisms from the Netherlands, but most recently we happened to see some amazing shoreline protections that are quite different in the Caribbean following all the hurricanes. Very different, unique structures and mechanisms for hopefully not ending up with a bunch of boulders out along the cliffs. The last thing I want to address is really more the issue of why the words managed retreat make such anxiety. Because I think everybody understands that it's managed and that it's over time. And I think, as Kevin Mullen has talked about many times, this is a multi-generational problem that we're addressing, and we're trying to develop a multi-generational plan. The problem being, and let me also say, everybody knows that we have sea level rise. We don't need to keep, we got it, and we just don't know exactly when, and it could be worst case. Jim, I thank you for bringing that up. It could be less worse. We still don't know, and we do see a lot of different reports come out. The long haul of this is, without going through this whole process, this whole discussion, we're giving a lot of information ultimately to our planning commission and our city council. And your city council will be the ones that in individual situations and issues make those final decisions about priority. The local coastal plan gives some guidance. This process gives some guidance. But when we don't know what our priorities are on that city council, we get anxious about some of these words. That's where some of the anxiety comes in. And Sam, fear-mongering is such a strong word to use. When you start talking about private property and using it for something for someone, for us for flood mitigation or other things, that brings fear to those property owners. Because you can't plan as a city without doing some take, and then you're going to have to come up with money to pay for that land, and the list goes on. And I have to say, in recent times, we use this very issue to be some of what went against the library in Sharp Park. That's at 50 feet above sea level. So when we want to talk about what our priorities are in a given situation, is it our homes and businesses in our community? Is it our beaches? That's when people get scared. And I think at some point when the council gives us guidance about what they are thinking, instead of the actions that we've seen so far that kind of lean one way, then we'll have a better idea to not be so afraid and come together as a community.
All right, I want to address a few things that were mentioned after I was last here, and I forgot to identify myself. I am also on the Pacifica Community Working Group. I've been studying for 30 years how the oceans affect precipitation, how that affects flooding and droughts and sea level and everything else. So I've been well versed in all the scientific literature. And we can get into a battle of sea level is going to rise, glaciers are going to melt on the extreme side, and I can show you an equal number of papers that will say it's much less than they say. And I think a lot of the fear about these extreme estimates, and they're just hypotheses, that sea level is going to rise 10 feet, whatever, is what sort of supports people for saying, well, we're going to have to do managed retreat if it's that extreme. And that rightfully scares everybody. And I'm very reassured to hear that the plan is that we can look and wait for trigger points to see if these hypotheses are really validated. would stand. You read a report, and there's something that came out within the last few weeks that they've seen Antarctica melting twice as fast as it ever did. It was a 25-year study. And we've known for a long time that there's these episodic meltings and then coolings, and these glaciers don't melt for another 30 years. And the glaciers that are melting are glaciers that are, their grounding point is like 500 to 1,000 meters below sea level. And in the Antarctic, you have deep water that's much warmer than surface water. And the reason these glaciers are melting this rapidly right now is because warm water is being upwelled. It's not that that water has got warmer, it's that the volume of that water is coming up and melting the glaciers. Last year, there was a study from the British Antarctic Survey that said this happens every so often. It could end and be very stable, or it could keep going and be catastrophic. It's 50-50. Either one is likely. There was a study 2 years before that looked at 300 years instead of this 25 years. And they said what we're seeing now is no different than natural variability over the last 300 years. And for that reason, I say you've got to wait. We can't just jump on and say, oh, it's going to be 10 feet. We don't know that. It's a hypothesis. And if you go too extreme, so we got to have managed retreat, that's not really where we should go yet. We've got to watch and see what's going on. In Antarctic Peninsula, they said, 20 years ago, they said, here's the climate canary, and it's showing us it's getting way too warm, and this is what's going to happen. Well, the British Antarctic Survey then said, it's now not warming. It's these cycles, the way these things are moving. So we can't just, this fear-mongering that some people do and say, oh, we're all going to die or it's all going to be overwhelmed. We've got to put that back and say, let's watch and read all the different papers before we jump on some kind of extreme solution like managed retreat.
Thank you. Okay, we have, I have one last question card. If you have a question or comment, please fill out a form. I know it seems tedious, but it's the way to keep us all organized. So Sue Beckmeyer. Sue still,
Thanks very much. I would like to echo some of the concerns that have been expressed regarding costs, time horizons, assumptions, and fear-mongering. I believe that while we must plan for the long term, we live in the short term. For people who've invested in our community, I think it is incumbent upon our elected officials who are going to make the decisions to take into account the needs of all of Pacifica, not just those who can turn out for a meeting every month or two, or who have the luxury to be following every item that comes before our city. We have a number of property owners in our town that need to be sure that their elected officials have their back.
any other ones? Richard right here.
As I recall, Richard Harris, as I recall, the original work plan for this project showed that the commission's grant was for this to be completed by December of this year. And there were a number of timelines in which various reports would come out and study could be made and public comment would be made, etc. Based on that original study, we're now somewhere between 2 and 3 months behind. And so my question, yes, is a question to the ESA and to the city and to the commission. Is the city being held by the commission to a December completion date notwithstanding that now we are somewhere between 2 and 3 months behind on this process, because if that is true, then what is going to happen is, as the studies so far been delayed finally come out, the time to understand, slog through 500 pages of studies and exhibits, et cetera, is going to be way squeezed, and people will think that they didn't get a fair chance to understand and comment on studies. So the bottom line question is that December deadline still holding?
So we have been communicating regularly with the Coastal Commission about our status and the timeline, and we have not yet, but we can ask for extensions in the future. So part of the reason why we are behind is because we expanded public engagement, which is really important. So if we need to ask for extensions, we will do so in the future.
At what point is that decision made?
I don't know yet.
Thank you.
Okay, a couple more. I think first up is Vicky. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm glad to see that the audience is a little bit more fuller than it was the last time we had this meeting. I think we had maybe 15 people here. So I appreciate everyone coming out, even with this wonderful weather we're having today. What I want to sort of reiterate is, as I understand it, managed retreat, because of the requirement, food grants has to be included in the adaptation plan, but not necessarily in the LCP. So I encourage everyone to go to their city officials to make sure that managed retreat is not included in LCP. It's very important. We have a coastal community, a lot of people living on this coast, and they all should be protected.
I have a question, but it has to do also with managed retreat. And I have been a citizen of Pacifica for 18 years. I have put my livelihood in this city. I have invested in this city. My house is in this city. And my question is, when I hear all these wonderful things about Holland, I also have to question that Holland really is a city that thinks different about its citizens. They care about the citizens. They don't have a mentality of us against them. We don't care if your house is going to flood because I am on top of the hill and I'm going to be okay. So when we talk about managed retreat, and you talk about Holland, I also would like to know how Holland did to protect the rights of the property owners that would flood and how they got compensated. And when we talk about managed retreat, I want to know if you're going to impose that label in my property, and I've been here for 15 years, and I knew the sea was going to rise, I knew that, but how that label is going to affect my right to sell my property, the right of somebody that is going to come and want to buy my house, to get insurance, to get loans. If you don't take that into consideration, if you just say, live with it, suck it, cupcake, I think that's completely unfair. I have been here for 18 years. So when you say that let's talk about managed retreat, I completely agree. Let's talk about managed retreat. But in the language of any managed retreat, it should be also consideration on the protection of the rights that we had when we got involved in the properties. If you're going to take some of our rights, you have to give us some of the protections. That's all I want to say. And my question is, how is that going to be addressed in the documents? If it's going to be addressed, just putting a label of managed retreat in my property and my neighbor's property is going to affect my livelihood, is going to affect my patrimony. It's going to affect what I can leave behind to my own family. So if you're going to take the value of my property and reduce it to zero potentially, you need to tell me how that's going to be solved for me too.
Thank you. Are there any final question cards? Okay. Well, I wanted to just, before I wrap us up here, I wanted to just bring back up the next step slide and reiterate, I think Kevin noted this earlier, there's a lot of time to provide great comments and feedback on both the preliminary draft adaptation plan and the final draft adaptation plan when it comes out at the end of July. Comments for today, comments received leading up to and after, 30 days after the plan will all be accepted. So there's lots of time. If you feel like you need a little bit more time to digest all the information, you have time to do so. You also have time to provide additional comments in addition to the great and really thoughtful comments that we received, questions that we received today. There are little cards on the back that have the sea level rise email address. That's where you can submit comments, or you can also submit the comment forms in the back of the room. And lastly, to remind you all that there will be another public workshop on August 11th. Ben might be back for that, so I might not be back, but I really appreciated you all being here today, and we really appreciate it, and I'll turn it over to Tina.
I just wanted to make a clarifying comment, and thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Please keep coming, stay engaged, and share information about future meetings with your neighbors and bring them. Just want to clarify that the language in the draft, the preliminary draft document, is that managed retreat is optional for private properties. And so that word kind of got dropped from the conversation as we went on today, but I just wanted to reiterate that. Again, thank you all for coming.